And with that wonderful introduction, which we'll leave off screen, welcome everyone. Welcome, Alex Harvey. Alex, you have written another book. And I'm going to go straight up with the first question. And why have you written another book on the Vikings?
Hilbert, I have written another book, and I wrote this second book because it was the Viking Age book that I've always wanted to read myself. I've read many, probably not all Viking books, but at least most that I see in shops aimed at, normal people and then high-level nerds like me and you. And there's always a set way of depicting the Viking Age. Most chapters one will be on the Lindisfarne raid, and then they'll ramp up from there and finish in about 1066, especially books on Viking Age England. And I always thought, having studied this period for about 7, 8 years, there's always more to be said, especially in popular history. Of course, within academia, um, filled with brainiacs, people know loads already, so there's less of a need to approach more obscure topics than there is for normal publishing. So that was largely the impetus for this second book. Instead of approaching a small niche bit of local history, I wanted to approach one of, or perhaps the most popular historical subject, or the Vikings. I suppose second only to the Romans, maybe.
That seems like a pretty good reason. And I must say the Wi-Fi connection is holding up pretty well for ninth century York, which is where you're joining us from. What's the time zone difference actually when you go back in time? Does that have an impact or
The time zone difference is about 15 hours, I think, between you and
okay.
I. And
That
then, of
works.
course, 11 centuries as well.
An 11 centuries, yeah. Julian calendar, give or take a few days or months, probably. Ah, fair enough. So, you mentioned in the book that when you were about 3 years old, you'd come home from school and you'd start scribbling away on A4 little stories. Were any of these already Viking related? And if so, can we expect these on our shelves any day soon?
I suppose if you were to go through a history of all my written works, the earliest would be these small A4 sheets of paper that I just wrote Doctor Who episodes on, that may one day be released, I'm not sure. And there were about 30 of those. They're all in a drawer at my house. Um, and I've written a few pieces of fiction, largely for fun. Writing is a great hobby. It's good to, get your ideas out on the page, even if no one else ever reads them. But I was on a hike with my dad several years ago, and he just said something like, "Why don't you just write something with the Vikings?" Um, and then another journey that inspired me. I was in the car with my wife last year, and she said, "Why don't you just write a history book?" Because I study archaeology in the early medieval period for a long time. I talk about it in lectures, but I'd never actually thought about writing anything. So that really prompted me to move away from just writing short stories for my own amusement and to do some non-fiction. And I must say that the non-fiction publishing world is far easier than trying to get fiction published. It's a completely different beast.
So the title of the book is the Forgotten Vikings, but why would you argue that the Vikings are forgotten? I mean, would you say they're forgotten? I kind of think they're very popular at the minute. They're being remembered more and more, and arguably have been remembered throughout various centuries in different ways. So why that title?
Great question. You've got to get the word Vikings in the title because that obviously lets everyone know what's in the book. Vikings, great word, powerful word. It carries with it a lot of imagery. And part of the reason why it does that is because this subject has been remembered for so long, but it's been remembered in various different ways. Not all of them too accurate to the historical period itself. We remember the Vikings as bloodthirsty pagan raiders. When the pendulum swings the other way, we might remember them as peaceful, profiteering traders. I think at the moment, the Viking Age is best remembered, kind of piggybacking on the works of Neil Price and others, for how weird the period was and how esoteric a lot of the elements were, especially the kind of mythology and cosmology. So the Vikings are remembered differently by different generations, owing to the scholarship of their time. So I thought it was a clever play. And given that this book covers mostly obscure or weird things that are left out on the pages of other books, an example would be the discovery of Madeira. I thought it would be, you know, I suppose, big brain moment to call it Forgotten Vikings because it's all the forgotten histories that you wouldn't normally appreciate, unless, of course, you've studied this period for multiple decades.
So I wanted to ask, in the popular imagination, we often say that the Viking Age started in 793. But you begin your book of the Viking Age at dawn, the chapter, in 536. So that's 2.5 centuries earlier than the raid to Lindisfarne. So just to quote a little bit later on, you say, whilst the raiders of Lindisfarne did not, as contemporary accounts suggest, appear out of nowhere like a bolt from the blue, they did come from somewhere, and that somewhere was, quite possibly, the Ragnarök of 536. So, can you explain that?
I would love to. So in 536, there was this devastating climatological disaster. I think current scholarly arguments place it as a ring of volcanic eruptions somewhere in the north. I've forgotten the exact location, but it would have been particularly devastating for the northern hemisphere, which I suppose the knock-on
Yeah.
effects were loads of ash clouds pumped into the atmosphere, which then diminished sunlight, which then had a knock-on effect on crops, farming. Without farming, which is often the backbone of many early medieval societies, you've got a breakdown in hierarchies and social strata. So it leads to a lot of chaos, basically. And then a couple years after this climate event, you had the spread of the Justinian plague, which is like a precursor to the Black Death, if you like. And that would have spread all over Europe. Archaeologically, in Scandinavia, you've got dated to around this decade, the middle of the 6th century, loads of abandoned farmsteads. A good example, there's a few on Gotland, which is island off the coast of Sweden, and also a few deposits of bread. So gold wasn't deposited during this crisis, but food was, which to me reflects, how dire times must have been, where bread was valued on the same level as gold was in previous periods. And then after 10 to 15, 20 years of this kind of social crisis, which particularly affected Scandinavia. It did affect other areas, but the further north you are, the worse off you're going to be hit by adverse weather. After this period, you start to see loads of ostentatious displays in the archaeological record of Scandinavia. So really blingy helmets, elaborate funeral monuments, these quite lavish displays. This is slightly contemporary with Sutton Hoo from England. So it's part of that same broader trend of North Sea mercenaries and warlords styling themselves. But Scandinavia, and especially, our idea of the Vikings, influenced by the access we have to the mythology, part of it is predicated on this idea of, like you said, Ragnarok, and the fact that this predestined cataclysm awaiting man and God at the end of things, and it's like it's always on its way. It's an event that's written in stone. It's slightly different to the Christian Judgment Day because it's more or less everyone is killed off, and then a new cycle begins. So I've always found that very interesting from like a philosophical standpoint. That's the word. And how, if such a belief was pervasive, and really we can't know that, but if it was, ingrained in the minds of the elite of the time, and they worked those traditions to kind of build up their layers of class and so on, what would that have on the mindset of someone? If it was, if you were brought up in a society where an extinction event was definitely going to happen in the nebulous future, and you knew it was. So it didn't necessarily matter what you did in your life, so long as you were remembered well. That would raise you very differently to if you were brought up in a Christian society. And I find that clash of psychologies really interesting. And that is one of the many factors why I think raiding broke out was this very different world in Scandinavia that had been affected by different climate processes than other areas of the world. And when eventually these frontiers clashed, not in 793, but beforehand, you had this bolt from the blue, weird Viking, that kind of hysteria in the sources.
Interesting that it goes back so far then that these events that happen in the middle of the 6th century might have had such an impact on that mindset, um, and changing the social order.
But I think putting a specific date on the start of the Viking Age doesn't really matter. Like in the book, I labor on about 536 as more likely than 793. But, no one woke up after the climate disaster in 536 and went, oh, I'm a Viking. Yes. These processes of periodization are glacial. You just wouldn't recognize it if you were alive at the time. In 200 years, historians will look back on our age and they won't, think that me and you having this Zoom call, a week later we would be in a different historical period. We've got no idea.
You mentioned some of the differences in the mindset, perhaps, between those parts of Europe that were Christian or Christianized, and then the North, Scandinavia, in particular, certainly by the 6th century and then going on into the 7th and the 8th centuries. But one area which is sort of liminal, and I think after that word you'll already know where I'm heading with this, is Frisia, and that's something you bring up a lot in the book. Is the position of Frisia in the Viking Age, the role of the Frisians, and I'll quote a little bit again on this topic from you, where you say the Frisians are the unsung heroes of the early medieval period, as we will come to see in the next chapter. But their importance as a cultural middleman between the populations in England and those in Scandinavia at the dawn of the 6th century cannot be underestimated. There, on the windswept tidal marshes, were a people linguistically and culturally alike both groups, afoot in both worlds, so to speak. The Frisians would go on to play an immensely important and similar role to Scandinavians in the ensuing centuries, though they have gone largely unnoticed by popular culture and many English history books. Really, this entire North Sea was a nexus of cultural, linguistic, and material exchange. And just to read one more sentence, and then there is a question coming at the end of this. I just like hearing about them so much in English.
Me too.
It's really nice. Um, you say Frisia is indeed intrinsic to understand how Viking Age raiding went from hit and run attacks on coastal sites to large scale military invasions. So, would you say then that the Frisians are somewhat forgotten when it comes to narratives of the Viking Age? And is that one of the reasons why you've included them so frequently in Forgotten Vikings?
One could say the Frisians are forgotten Vikings because, of course, they would have made up a not insignificant proportion of soldiers and raiders overseas in England and indeed other places. The Frisians, for me, um, having studied them since 2019, I think, or earlier, they're right in the middle of what you'd call the Viking world and then like the Anglo-Saxon slash Carolingian world. And like I wrote there, they have a foot in both worlds. So it all comes down to, and I'll try not to repeat myself from the last video we made too much, perceptions of marshlands. From dry land, a marsh is this weird nowhere place where nothing happens. The horizon is endlessly flat. You may have had mosquitoes carrying malaria at the time. Not necessarily a safe environment and a bit weird, so perceptions of it are coloured. Whereas if you're in the marshland and you're in a boat, it's the equivalent of a changeover station at a subway interchange. It's a rapid transit point, like a crossroads where you can shoot off in any direction. If you're in a boat, if you're walking, it's a far more difficult. As I have walked through several marshlands, it's horrible.
Another, perhaps also understudied area of the Viking Age is the Iberian Peninsula. And you mentioned this right from the get go in your section on the earliest raids, and perhaps ones that go around the same time or even before Lindisfarne. And in particular, you mention a much debated term, Majus. So could you talk to us a little about that?
Yeah, so Magius, I suppose to use its broadest possible meaning, is like pagan. So it's an Arabic term that is often found in Iberian or Middle Eastern sources closer to Baghdad, and it means people who are of a religion that isn't Abrahamic. So it's not Christians, it's not people of Jewish faith, it's Zoroastrian pagans, it's Tengrists, it's miscellaneous kind of shaman religions. The context of the word changes depending on where the source is. So on the Iberian Peninsula, in a Spanish context, Majus means Basque pagans. So the people of the Basque country who are living in and around the Pyrenees with their own kind of culture, faith, and ideas. Um, Later in the 9th century, the term becomes almost exclusively, used for Scandinavian pagans. So it's used to describe the raiding activities that most famously kick off in about 844 with the sacking of Seville, which is when a moderate Viking fleet ends up in southern Spain and deals quite a lot of damage to the Arabic armies there. But there are actually a few earlier mentions of this term, Magius, one as early as 793, so directly parallel with the Lindisfarne raid, is a reference to the Magius fighting alongside some Basque Christians against an Arab army at the town of Astorgas, I think, off the top of my head. And then there's a few references kind of every decade after that for a couple, maybe 20, 30 years, roughly the same time as the Danes are invading Charlemagne's Frisia, and they're fighting merchants in the Baltic Sea, and raids are also intensifying in Ireland and England. So it's all contemporary. Whether or not this use of the term Magius is actually describing early Viking raids, for me, it could go either way. But I think it's important to bring that into the discussion because at the end of the day, the whole reason we study history is to discuss. It's to open up arguments, new debates, and if things like this are just, getting left on the cutting room floor because one person said definitely not Vikings, then that's a shame because even if it's not Vikings, it's a piece of interest in history. It's a piece of wider geopolitical context of the start of the Viking Age, I suppose, of these frontier raids that are happening in northern Spain.
And speaking of wider geopolitical, we'll cast that net even wider. And you maybe can already sense where this is going. But in chapter 4, you delve into Icelanders in Mexico. And I must say, I raised an eyebrow when I read that and thought, wait, am I reading Graham Hancock? Or but anyway, not to get a lawsuit. But do you want to give us a little teaser about what happens in chapter 4?
Yeah, so there's this outlandish theory. So there's this obscure saga about a character features in it called Bjorn, and he leaves Iceland and goes off to an unknown realm for 30 years. Later in the narrative, a separate character washes up on the shore of this unknown land, and they are kidnapped by tribesmen. They don't really go into any detail, but the locals, and they take him to their chief. And it turns out the chief is this chap Bjorn, who's been in this alien realm for about 30 years. And he lets the new Icelanders go. And he's like, I'm going to stay here. These people respect me. That's more or less the only detail we have. So it's an alien realm that I think is described with lingo that relates to kind of tangled reeds, which some have argued to be a description of coral reefs, which I think it's a reach. It's a bit of a reach. But anyway, the whole association with Mexico comes from these coincidences that a few people have peddled, where the date of this saga lines up with the Chetl myth, or Quetzalcoatl. But obviously, the issues there is that these are just coincidences, for one. Number two is that Hernan Cortez famously, for lack of a better word, bollocksed most of these sources, completely invented almost all of them and manipulated the others. So any kind of date that lines up with a white European in the distant past may as well be discounted. The reason I included it in the book is because I find one of the things I find the most interesting about the Viking Age is how far they actually traveled. And that's in terms of actual evidence. So we know they got to North America. We know they got to Greenland, Baghdad. These distances are already massive without having to then invent other locations that they assuredly didn't reach. And I find in sagas, at least, there's an almost equal blend of real locations and then made up ones. In some sagas, real figures of history, like Ingvar the Far Travelled, are mixed in a story with dragons and floating cities. So it's really interesting where the fantasy and the reality blend. And this saga is one such example. I think Bjorn's escapades in wherever he was are just a made up land. It's borrowing from a historical tradition that's also found in, Irish tales about a mysterious land to the far west. It doesn't matter what the place is because it doesn't exist. It's just this made up, idealized kind of haven. And I thought it would be an interesting note to end on. And almost everyone who's read the book then asks me a question about it because it's so bizarre and it's I've never seen it in a book before. I think it's one of them really funny bonkers theories that has come off the back of the Viking Age, very similar to the Kensington runestone. And it serves as a really good way of making people doubt the sagas because undoubtedly these are really useful sources, but you can't use them to pinpoint spots on a map, well, for most cases, and say, oh, this description of a vaguely jungly world must be Mexico. Who's to say that the authors didn't just have as wild an imagination as we did, and they didn't just think, oh, this will be mental if we just send them to this, jungle place. Where is it? Who cares?
Yeah, and I suppose the Old Norse language isn't exactly equipped to describe a jungle, so it'd be interesting to see what kind of words they actually use and people kind of take it. But yeah, I think that'll be one of the more interesting chapters for people to read when they do get the book. Um, Icelanders in Mexico, a recipe for getting sunburnt, I would say.
Oh yeah, it wouldn't have gone well if the story is, of course, anywhere near the truth,
Yeah.
which it most likely isn't.
Is it? By the by, I was going to make a video on this at some point. I came across this similarly crackpot theory that there are some of these codices, the Maya codices, allegedly portray white people. But I mean, again, it's just like if you turn the kind of the page, then you see that on the next page there's blue people and yellow and green and
Yeah, and also it may as well have a watermark that says Hernando Cortez, 16th century, wrote this
yeah, pretty
because he
much.
he used the myths of the Mayans, well, not the Mayans, but the locals at the time to ratify his own presence on the Yucatan Peninsula. So
Yeah.
like any even tangentially connected myth that spoke about white people, he was like, yeah,
Save that one. Yeah.
yeah, that's me.
Yeah, we'll keep that one. Burn all the other ones. Like we'll have that. That fits the narrative.
Yeah, it's just so there's basically no way of knowing. And I'm not a Mesoamerican specialist. My knowledge is only through this one reading of this saga that few people have said is Mexico.
It'd be a fun thing to do a sort of alternative history about. Like, let's suppose it was real, and to sort of write a little fiction thing. I don't know. Could be interesting, and just have
Yeah,
loads of little. I don't know. I'm sure that's been done, to be fair, but
someone has on a dark corner of the internet is some alternate history. Yeah.
yeah. All right. Okay. So, in keeping with the slightly fantastical theme, what's one place or event that you'd get into a time machine to observe? So as I get into a time machine and sort of walk around, but you also have the option of, let's say that you could fly a drone back in
Oh,
time,
okay.
in case it's like a battle, you don't want to, get
Yeah.
absolutely riddled with various poxes, then you can sort of send a drone in your stead. What, where would you go and when in this period of the Viking Age?
I would go to the Azores in the middle of the ninth century when at least one boatload of Scandinavians with some sheep got there and
Ah,
may have done a bit of farming according to the limited excavations we've got. I just want to see what their reaction would be to this pristine landscape in the middle of nowhere. Like the horizon would have been empty, just ocean, and you'd have had these intensely wooded, beautiful paradise islands. And the only evidence we've got that there were Scandinavians here is, sheep poo, some mice bones, and pollen that can be traced to the northern hemisphere, and it's dated to the middle of the Viking Age. So it's almost 95% probability it's Scandinavians who got there. But, were they shipwrecked? Did they set out because they'd heard that there was some islands? Clearly, no one stayed. It was just like a season worth of farming. I'd just like to see what was going on there, really.
I mean, nothing to me says Mediterranean beach escape like sheep poo, mice, and pollen, but that's Viking Age archaeobotany for you. But that's an interesting one. That's not what I was expecting. What you would say. I was thinking you kind of, your Battle of Hastings or your Battle of Svolder, or perhaps some kind of religious ritual. But interesting that you bring up the Madeira, because that's not a location most people associate with the Viking Age, really.
No, well, I mean that's it because you say Vikings and you picture them in some snow, maybe a sunlit fjord. We don't often put them in the Sahara Desert or on a windswept volcanic island. I know Iceland technically is volcanic, but it's got that certain aesthetic, hasn't it? It's got the Northern Lights, it's got the huge glaciers, whereas Vikings on Madeira, with all its, you know, brown, red, rocky pillars, really jagged mountains, it doesn't scream Vikings were here. But of course, they perhaps were.
Oh, and I'm sure we can read more about that in the book.
Indeed, and many other topics.
So, how did you find writing on a theme that, as you said already, has been written about a lot by some really big names in the past? Was it more difficult than writing something on a more niche subject like your last book on the Isle of Axholme in a way, or did that make it easier?
It made it easier and harder in different ways. So when you're writing a book on a topic that no one's really explored, or maybe only a couple books have, you have a lot more opportunity to spread your wings. You can talk about all sorts of, wacky theories, and you can introduce topics, which comes with its own hurdles. It can be difficult to introduce historical topics, for the average reader. When you're writing a Viking book, because so much of the period, at least in England, is ingrained in pop culture, you get a lot more wiggle room to kind of play with expectations, to use recognizable names like King Alfred as like a mic drop moment. Whereas if a reader didn't know who King Alfred was, you wouldn't be able to do that. But he's like just one example of a figure from the Viking Age who everyone will have heard of at some point. Canute the Great's another one. There's a chapter largely dedicated to Canute that plays with the idea that we think of him as a Viking king, just like we do Harold Bluetooth. But I kind of approach it from the perspective of he's definitely not a Viking, really. Not even our modern definition of Viking really suits Canute. This is a really canny, clever European monarch who knitted his way into the church and the European sphere of influence. And towards the end of his career, he's not raiding, he's doing everything but raiding. He's going on pilgrimages to Rome, he's crafting friendships with the Holy Roman Emperor.
Listening to monks singing off Ely, which was still an island back then. Yeah, being depicted in religious books, clutching crosses. It's quite a different image to perhaps the, what would you call it, the horrible histories version of Knut that we might imagine. Which is the fascinating thing about the Viking Age, that it's so multifaceted in the truest sense of the word, having many faces.
Well, that's it. And I tried to use each chapter. There's 10 chapters in the book, and with each one, as I was writing it, I was always trying to keep in mind what's the one weird fact or weird angle, new, refreshing, forgotten perhaps, that you wouldn't find in another book, and what makes this chapter unique. So I tried to structure some of the chapters in quite abstract ways. So there's a very long chapter on everywhere the Vikings may have traveled or did travel, and I've structured it via the 9 realms of Old Norse mythology. So each of those carry with them a certain aesthetic because they, like Canute, have become ingrained in pop culture. Um, that's obviously a wrong way of reading what the 9 realms are. In their original usage, it basically just means, oh, a couple other realms over there. There's not even a specific number or that much detail about each one. But, and again, this goes back to writing a book on the Viking Age. Because the Viking Age is so well known, everyone or most people will have heard of the 9 realms, be it because of Marvel or the, God of War games. So I was able to use that and the aesthetics that come with the term Muspelheim, for instance, and then use that to talk about real locations. And then there's a chapter on identity and what we really mean when we say Viking. And I looked through some poetry that talks about different layers of personhood in Old Norse society. And I used that to kind of break through a lot of the layers of people like Canute to identify who they were on their own terms.
Good stuff. I would highly recommend that everyone goes and reads it, because it is, for someone like me who's read a lot about the Viking Age, it's what I study. There's still new things that came from reading the book, and even in reading over things that I've come across in several other books, it's brought in a fresh way. So I think Forgotten Vikings, it lives up to the name, in that you do find certain details or angles of looking at things, or perhaps a construction of the framework of this age that is centered around the figures of the Vikings that are traveling around and raiding and trading and discovering new places. That is novel in many ways, or perhaps has been forgotten. But I wanted to ask before we round off, and before I give the last word to you, have you got any plans for future books that you could perhaps let us in on, or give a sneak peek to History with Hilbert viewers?
Of course, I would be happy to do that. So this is my second book. This is the second one coming out. And as of last week, I just finished the first draft for the third book, which is slightly different. It's more of a earlier we mentioned writing books about obscure topics and writing books about well-known topics. I'd say this is closer to the obscure. This will be a book on obscure Dark Age or early medieval kingdoms that made up England, Wales, and Scotland. You've got your big names like Wessex and Northumbria that most people will have heard of. Below them, there's a tier of second-rate kingdoms like Lindsey, Elmet, Strathclyde. Below them are even more ephemeral polities, tribal entities and territories like Penguin or um, Airk, Kintis, Asia, all these bizarre words. I may even be making some of those up. You won't know. But that book, yeah, is like series of vignettes, and each chapter is quite small, and each one talks about a different kingdom, analyzing all the disparate forms of evidence we have, and building up a map of early medieval Britain, again on its own terms, rather than viewing this as a road to unification. We'll just be analysing all of these local histories and stacking them alongside one another. It's been a really fun book to write, very different to the Viking one, because it's not a grand narrative, it's like 60 mini narratives, and that should be releasing next year.
Excellent, and that will be Lost Kingdoms. But before we round
Little
off,
Kingdoms.
sorry, Little Kingdoms. Little Kingdoms releasing next year. But this year, in case you already can't wait to read that, I most certainly cannot, and I hope to have you again on
Of
here for an
course.
interview about that when
Of
we are so
course.
far. But just in your own words, what would you say about Forgotten Vikings? How would you summarize it? Why should people read it?
I would say if you have even a smattering of interest in the Viking Age, you've already learned a little bit. You may have watched a couple TV shows, maybe a documentary or two, read a book, and you want to know more, then definitely give it a chance. Because I think, as Hilbert said, I really did try to write it for an audience in mind who already knew a little bit and wanted to dive deeper into the Viking Age. If you know nothing about the Viking Age, then I think it would represent a really interesting case study if you were to read this book first, because it's a different way of approaching this well-known topic. It foregoes most of the stereotypes I've seen in other books, and um, most of the people who've read it so far have all said that they've come away with a different perspective on the age. I really enjoyed writing it, and I suppose if you don't enjoy writing something, then you definitely won't enjoy reading it. And I can honestly say I loved writing it, so we'll see.
I think that's definitely good praise. Hey, Alex, thank you very much for coming on the show, and looking
Thank
forward
you,
to
Hilbert.
reading the rest of Forgotten Vikings. And I hope many of you do too. Link will be in the description below to get your copy. I don't know. I'm not sure if I'll keep. Oh, yeah, okay. We go into some weird territory.
I would love to. So in 536, there was this devastating climatological disaster. I think current scholarly arguments place it as a ring of volcanic eruptions somewhere in the north. I've forgotten the exact location, but it would have been particularly devastating for the northern hemisphere, which I suppose the knock-on effects of lots of ash.
That's a
Yeah.
moment right there.
Nice. Oh dear.
Lots of ass.
Lots of booty.
That's a Freudian slip if I've ever heard one.
Oh dear. No,
Don't
can't
worry,
believe this. Oh
I'll get
well,
rid of that. I think
that
the
one's quite tame. You can put that in the bloopers.
I'll put that at the end. I think that's quite funny. The Vikings, famous
Yeah,
for their booty.
yeah. Well, yeah.